Right, let's now head over to Bangkok, where an international meeting in Bangkok fell short of its aim of completing fruitful preparation so an agreement can be reached in December on guidelines to implement the 2015 Paris Climate Change Agreement. A cancellation of $2 billion of its $3 billion pledged to the Green Climate Fund and obstruction of the fund's replenishment by the Trump administration is part of the issues being raised as a reason why there are developed North is not keen on financial commitments. Our Foreign Affairs editor, Lilian Odera, with that special report from the Bangkok Climate Talk.
Bangkok, the city that never goes to sleep. A bustling nightlife and a street food lover's paradise. Hot and humid temperatures that is cooled down with intermittent showers in the day. This was the perfect setting for 6-day talks aimed at brokering deals that would accelerate progress in the battle against rising global carbon emissions by adopting a completed text that could be presented at the 24th conference of the parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in Poland in December. The effectiveness of the Paris Agreement depends on the delivery of a robust set of implementation guidelines. Nearly 300 pages of text need to be refined so that textual negotiations on the climate change rulebook can begin on day 1 in Katowice.
Also impacted the livelihood of the fisher folk and also the country's tourism industry.
We want climate justice! When do you want it? Now! There is no climate justice without gender justice! Another one is possible!
Outside the conference facilities of the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, activists were piling pressure on the delegates to come to some amicable agreement on the outstanding issues.
We have a lot of people around the world. We have youth, we have women, we have many diversity, because we can see that if climate change happens, it not happen only in specific place, but it happens and it affects all over the world, all over every country. So we right here is the person. We are here for we are the person who been affected by climate change. So we want to come here to spread our voice. We want climate change fund. The reason that we want this fund is that we can see that many countries, for example, many developed countries or many capitalists, many investors, they also cause a lot of climate change. They stimulate the global warming, but sometimes they just don't have to pay anything. They just nothing happen because they are rich and they have power.
The Paris Agreement, which was adopted by almost 200 nations and is due to come into force in the year 2020, set sweeping goals of ending the fossil fuel era this century. A key issue in Bangkok was climate finance. There were notable disagreements over fair financing for implementation of the rules by developing countries and the scale and details of reporting progress.
The like-minded developing countries can call on developed countries to honor their commitments under the Paris Agreement and not attempt to renegotiate or rewrite the Paris Agreement. In the ongoing negotiations on the Paris Agreement work program, to frame the guidelines and procedures for the implementation of the Paris Agreement, it is vital for all parties to respect and maintain the very delicate balance reached in Paris in 2015 and negotiate in good faith.
If you look at issues of transparency, we are being told that there is going to be no enhancement in the reporting requirement for developed countries. Not only that, they don't want to have the NATCOMs and BRs, which they were supposed to submit, and they only want to get into a common framework. They don't want to continue with the systems which were in place under the convention in the post-2020 period.
This is expansion of the CDM, and it has three mechanisms there. The cooperative action, the sustainable development, and the non-market mechanisms. And all of those are important for Kenya. And we should not think that it's only for energy.
Patricia Espinoza, Executive Secretary for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, said at the closing press briefing for the Bangkok meeting that progress was made on most issues, but nothing was finalized.
All countries are committed to putting the guidelines in place so that the agreement can be fully implemented. And while groups did not make statements in the opening plenary, they have uploaded their statements, and you may have seen that this is what they have said. They have reaffirmed their commitment to putting the guidelines in place. And everyone here also has had the deadline that they themselves, through the COP decisions, have established in order to finalize those guidelines, which is COP24 in Katowice in Poland.
Particularly frustrating for developing countries and civil society alike was an apparent refusal by developed countries, led by the United States, to engage constructively on key discussions about finance issues, such as their communication of upfront information, the progress to establish a new long-term finance goal, and replenishment of the Green Climate Fund. It has been 5 days of very intense negotiations by the parties from over 190 countries who are parties to the Paris Climate Agreement. There's been some relative progress to report, especially on issues of mitigation and adaptation, but there's still very little progress to report on when it comes to the issues of financing, which remains very tricky as the parties now prepare for COP24 to be held later in Poland. Now, as the Bangkok session comes to a close, the developing countries are still showing very little commitment on how they will intend to finance the developing countries in order to mitigate the effects of climate change. The least developed countries argue that they lack the tools and resources to cope with the devastating impacts of climate change. Addressing loss and damage is integral to an effective global response to climate change, and the rulebook must reflect this to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement.
We are repeating this. We never caused this problem. Africa did not cause this problem. Other developing countries did not cause this problem. So finance should not be negotiated as if we are here to beg for money. It is an obligation. And it is very clear in Article 9 that developed countries are obliged, have an obligation to provide the money.
Kenya wants to see clear guidance on transparency issues for implementation in terms of climate change adaptation, climate change mitigation, and means of implementation. That is supporting finance, supporting the technology development and transfer, and capacity building.
We have resolved to develop on a low emissions, climate resilient pathway. And to be able to do that, we must use technologies that will enable this, so that we don't make the same mistake that developed countries made. They have wiped out their biodiversity. Their environment is not as natural as it was. We want to preserve this and balance between development and conservation.
We, the people from the developing country, we are still not very happy with what is going on within the finance sector, because our partners are not keen. There are issues which they want to lock, mixing terminologies, requiring loans to be accounted for as part of climate finance, which we are saying no, loans should not be part of it and it should be reported differently.
The Paris Agreement's provisions that countries are working towards operationalizing include increased action to deal with the impacts of climate change and increased and transparent support for developing country action in the form of finance, technology, cooperation, and capacity building. The provisions also include the goal of limiting global temperature increase this century to well below 2 degrees Celsius, while pursuing efforts to limit the increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius through transparent and ambitious emission reductions.
The moment that many in the climate justice community have warned about for a long time has come this week. The US, after declaring its intention to walk away from Paris, has now pulled out all the stops to gut it on its way out. And what's worse is other global north governments are just complicitly standing on the sidelines. But while what we're seeing here may feel new, it's actually part of a long history of multilateral disruption that far predates Trump. Given the US's track record with international agreements, including predecessors to Paris, government should not be so short-sighted as to cave to the US's demands in the hopes that it will somehow convince the US to stay or make it easier for the US to re-enter in 2 or 6 years from now.
Yes, the role of the US is very, very important in this process, and more so in getting the rule book for the Paris. Just to note that the US is also here trying to be part of the developing of the rule book, but the feeling has been that the fact that they sort of technically, if you put it like that, pull out of the Paris Agreement, the feeling is they shouldn't interfere with the other processes or other commitments that will come, or other pledges that will come from other developed countries.
The kind of extreme options you see on the table, even if the process is now clear that co-chairs are going to work on the text, it's really hard to imagine how these extreme options are going to be brought together in a manner that we see agreement happening on many of these options. Finance happens to be at the core of it. We have seen developed countries blocking the conversation on finance, completely going back on their words and what is very clearly enshrined in the Paris Agreement itself.
It caused a lot of question into this process and its efficacy and its relevance. Doesn't mean we're giving up on it entirely, but the message is we cannot just simply pin our hopes on this.
It's one of the open issues. I would say that I'm very hopeful that because of the importance of the issue and the fact that this agenda is really about well-being of people everywhere in the world, leaders will be able to send, to give the positive signals that are needed in order to be able to have a successful outcome.
Governments have empowered the co-chairs to turn the progress made so far into a more solid basis for negotiations in Poland. It is now vital for the co-chairs to change the course of the negotiations away from diplomatic doldrums towards a win-win approach and craft middle ground options that the whole world can get on board with at COP24. Lilian Odera, KTN News.